Jesus was the greatest soul winner to ever walk the face of this earth. As we look at what He did, He came to this earth with a mission. He clearly stated His mission was to seek and to save the lost. It's interesting when you talk with Christians how easy it is for them to have that same heart. Anytime they've had something to do with someone becoming a Christian, there's just this overwhelming joy. You'll hear someone say out of joy, not bragging, but out of joy, they'll say, I invited in the church for the first time, and now look, they're being baptized into Christ. Or I continually encourage them when they started visiting, and I'm so thankful now that they're committing their life to Christ. Or I loved having the opportunity to study with them, and now look, they're becoming a Christian. I just can't hardly imagine a Christian not being excited about helping someone else know God, to know the Savior, to be a part of God's people. And yet I also know this, that many times as Christians we feel inadequate. We feel like we could do a much better job than what we do. Oftentimes we feel probably a little bit handicapped from a lack of confidence or maybe even straight up fear. I just don't know exactly what to say or what to do. In this one lesson, I'm not suggesting to you that we can answer all the things that could be asked about how to be like Jesus in reaching souls. But I would invite you into a study of John the 4th chapter that gives us a beautiful view of how Jesus literally reached out to a woman beginning with conversation. Look, conversations as a rule of thumb will never convert someone. There has to be that time that they stop and they open God's holy word and they study it for themselves. But conversations are almost always a part of someone first coming into that study. Conversations lead to studies. And so it's awesome for us to be able to study Jesus tonight and see how He participated in life with the people around Him. First, I'd like for you to notice that when we go into John the 4th chapter, we see Jesus leaving Judea. If you'll notice there in verse 3, He left Judea and departed again to Galilee. Now, there's just something interesting about the fact that He was leaving Judea, because Judea was full of a lot of people that thought highly of themselves. There's a pompous pride about them where they were very comfortable looking down upon other people. And it's interesting there that it says Jesus left Judea. The word there in the original text for left is a very strong word. It carries with it even the idea of abandon. Now, I'm not suggesting to you that during Jesus' public ministry He never went back to Jerusalem, but He did not go back to spend much time. He chose to spend most of His time outside of Judea. In one sense, He was looking at all of these people where so many of them were self-righteous. You had to be a part of their rabbinical schools. You had to be a part of their Pharisee-type thinking or other sects of Jews. And if you know your geography, you had Judea stacked right on top of that. You had Samaria stacked right on top of that. You had Galilee. And He said, I'm leaving Judea. Well, where did He go? It's interesting in verse 4 where He went. But He needed to go to Samaria. So it's interesting that not only did it simply say He went to Samaria, it said He needed to go to Samaria. I love the way the King James says it. Those of you that are reading out it, notice it says, He must needs go through Samaria. It's a greater emphasis just in the wording there. It's to say that Jesus is saying, I'm leaving Judea behind. Where are you going, Jesus? I must go through Samaria. Think again of that map. A Jew of that day would have not gone through Samaria as a rule of thumb. That would have been a sharp exception. Instead, they would have made a backward sea. They would have gone eastward. They'd crossed over the Jordan River. They would have gone north around Samaria, and then they would have crossed back over into Galilee. And you say, that is a long way to travel when you're on a donkey or on your feet, and you're telling me they're going to travel all the way around like that instead of going due north. Absolutely, that's how sharp the prejudice was against the Samaritans. So you have in Judea those that were real comfortable looking down their nose at individuals, and then you have just north of them the ones that they loved to look down their nose at. There wasn't hardly anybody any lower to those of Judea than a Samaritan. And so most any Jew would have went around, and instead Jesus says, I'm leaving Judea and I must needs go through. You can imagine those traveling with Jesus were probably thinking, we're not going back through Samaria. We are? We're going back through Samaria? Yes. Jesus, why do you need to go through Samaria? There were souls there. Souls that the Lord was going to reach out to. You see, what He literally did was He crossed a border to reach individuals that most Jews would have never had any concern, love, or compassion for. He literally crossed a boundary that most of them would have said, I'm not doing that. Hands off that. When we think about how are we going to be effective in reaching others, I don't want to belittle how blessed we are to have Christian fellowship. And perhaps this doesn't apply to everyone here. But could I just pause for a moment and just make a statement? And if it's true to you, own up to it. And if it's not, say, that's not me. But we as Christians, we love doing things with people that are Christians. We love fellowship meals with other Christians. We like even going to ball games with other Christians. We love fun night with Christians. We even like doing evangelism if we do it as a group of Christians and go on a campaign together. We like studying the Bible as long as we're getting together with a bunch of other Christians. It's interesting how good we are at doing things with Christians. And then it's interesting when you start talking about reaching out to those who are not Christians. That's what evangelism is all about. All of a sudden people start backpedaling. Well, I don't know if we need to be. I don't know if I need to spend. Can you imagine how they felt about Jesus? We're going to reach out to who? You're not going to cross that border. You're not going to talk. It wasn't just the racial border, it was the gender border. You, a Jewish man, you're going to talk to a Samaritan woman? You imagine in your mind right now, and I hope you can say, I can't imagine anybody, but you imagine in your mind right now somebody that you think would not be fit for the kingdom of heaven. And that's a border you've put in place that God doesn't recognize. Jesus didn't see the border of a Samaritan. Jesus saw souls. Jesus didn't see the border of gender that would stop Him from seeing souls. And so if there's a certain financial status that, I don't know if I would reach out to them. What, wealthy people don't need the gospel? They don't need to be saved. They're going to buy their way into heaven. What are they going to do on the day of judgment? Poor people? Do they need the gospel? What nationality doesn't need Jesus? You see, if we're going to be like the Lord, what we're going to see real quickly is all of these borders that we put up in our mind, in God's mind, they don't exist when it comes to the question of whether or not we reach out to souls. It's interesting that even the woman made a comment at the end of verse 9. When Jesus started reaching out and having friendly dialogue with her, notice she said at the end of verse 9, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Isn't that interesting? Because Jesus was a Jew and He was having dealings with it. You see, He was so different from the other Jews because He didn't see the boundaries that others saw. Can I show you quickly a couple other passages? If you want to hold your finger here, back up to Luke the 5th chapter. In Luke the 5th chapter, Jesus crossed another boundary. There was a boundary in their day of most of the Jews hating tax collectors because tax collectors, they felt like robbed from them and that they were traitors to other Jews because they were Jews that went to work for the Roman government collecting taxes and oftentimes unfairly. And so look at Luke the 5th chapter, verse 27. I want you to think about a border. I want you to think where Levi was setting. In verse 27, after these things, he went out and he saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax office. And he said to him, follow me. Now, how many Jews do you think in that day and time would have looked over inside a tax collector's office and thought, I wish I could do something to help that person. I wish I could help them learn about how to be saved and who their God is. Oh no, most Jews would have looked over and said, there he is. Look at him sitting in his office, sitting there just waiting to steal our money, keep part of it for himself and send the rest of it to the Roman Empire. Oh, most would have never allowed their eyes to go across the boundary of inside the tax collector's office. As a matter of fact, just to reinforce that, see in verse 30, the scribes and the Pharisees complained against his disciples, saying, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and with sinners? You remember in Luke the 19th chapter? In Luke the 19th chapter, we see not just a tax collector, but notice this is Zacchaeus. And look in verse 2, who was a chief tax collector. You know what most people would have seen in that day? A chief tax collector. And maybe the rest of that verse, he was rich. And maybe in verse 3, he was short in stature. Or maybe in verse 4, they would have seen him as the man that was up in the tree. But notice in verse 5 what the Lord saw. He looked up and he saw him, and he said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay in your house. Jesus, you're not going to do that. You don't understand. Jews just don't do that. You're going to invite yourself into a tax collector's house? Don't you see that little rich short man that steals from us all the time and hangs out in trees? He's the chief tax collector, for crying out loud. Don't have anything to do with him. What did Jesus do? He walked straight up to him and invited himself onto his turf. Verse 7, and when they saw it, they all complained, saying, he has gone to be the guest with a man who is a sinner. How are we going to reach people if we don't cross borders? If we don't ever reach out and show love, how would we ever reach them? Remember in Luke the 15th chapter, we know that chapter so well and we love it so deeply because one of the most beautiful stories told in the Bible, the story of the prodigal son. We see a picture of God, our Heavenly Father, running out to meet His son, and He falls upon His neck and He kisses Him over and over. And we see this beautiful story of redemption. We see the lost coin being found. We see the lost sheep being found. But do you remember how this chapter begins? Look at verse 15. Then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to hear him. The reason of that is because chapter 14 ties into this. Jesus had just been teaching. He taught a powerful lesson on humility. When you invite someone to your house, who are you going to invite into your house? Look at back in verse 14. I'd like to show you in verse 12. When you give a dinner or a supper, Jesus is talking here, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. Now pause there right now. What border would you have to cross that you've never crossed before if you had a dinner? Big feast, whole works, clean the house, and you didn't invite anybody that Jesus just listed. You say, well, I'd have to cross some borders. I've never invited somebody to my house that I have to go pick them up because they don't own a vehicle, and I have to bring them to my house. And he says, notice where the payback's going to be. Verse 13, but when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you shall be repaid the resurrection of the just. He says, do some things that nothing could be paid back on earth because the people you help are in such dire straits. They couldn't do anything to help you. Do something. Somebody said, why would I do that? One reason why, the Lord said do it. Number two, it'd do us all some good to cross some boundaries that we've never crossed before. Listen, when we don't reach out to souls, it's not because they're not there, and it's not because they won't come. It's because Christians have not gone like our Lord went. There's Samaritan women. There's chief priests, chief tax collectors. There are the poor and the maimed all around us. You say, how did he get into so many people's lives to teach so many people? He had multitudes following him. How? He crossed the boundaries that human eyes put into place that God's eyes never see or recognize. And so it is when we look at that 15th chapter. I'd like for you to notice there in Luke 15, then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes did what? They complained, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. So he spoke this parable to them, saying, and then we have the parable of those three beautiful stories. What's the point? As we go back to John the 4th chapter, we see the point is real clear. That this in John the 4th chapter is not an exception for Jesus. This is what Jesus constantly did. He constantly looked for souls, and he didn't let, whether it was financial boundaries or whether it was boundaries literally geographically or racially, he didn't let anything stop him from seeing the worth of a soul. Number two, I'd like for you to see how important it was to the Lord that once he made that contact, to start out that contact on common ground. Have you ever thought about who's sitting here? Imagine Jesus Christ, God in flesh, sitting with a Samaritan woman. And what do we see? We see a lot of differences. God and a human, a Jew and a Gentile, a man and a woman, someone who lived in complete purity and someone who was immoral, someone who was never married, someone who was oft married. For most of us, all we would ever be able to see is look at that situation and see oil and water. So many differences. And what was it Jesus could see? Jesus could see a common ground to begin on. What was it they both needed? They both needed a drink of water. You see, when we humble ourselves and be kind, we will almost always find that the person around us has more in common than what we first thought. Listen, it's pride and arrogance that causes us to think that others don't have things in common with us. Jesus, in his humility, was able to set at a time that there was a lot of things. There were a lot of things that was different. But he was able to see this. You see there in verse 6, Now Jacob's well was there. Jesus, therefore, being wearied from his journey, sat thus by the well. And notice he says in 7, to the Samaritan woman, she came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, give me a drink. Do you see the humility in that? That he, being a Jewish man, would even speak to a Samaritan woman. But not only that, he would lower himself beneath her to ask a favor of her. Have you seen people? They kind of usually pull their shoulders back when they say, I don't ask anybody for anything. I don't like to ask for help. You're not going to win many souls. The way you win souls is putting yourself beneath people. Listen, you have some things I need. I have some things you need. You see, at this point, when he tells her that he has some water for her, she looks real quickly and says, no, you don't even have anything to draw water with. I think you need me. He reinforces it. I do. I'm thirsty. I've been traveling. I'm weary. I do need a drink. But let me tell you about the water I can give you, because if you knew who was asking, you would want this water. Well, what kind of water is that going to be? Drop down in 13, 14, and 15 and notice Jesus answered. He said to her, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give them will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a foundation, a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. Notice her response. The woman said to him, Sir, give me this water. See, now they both have done it. He asked her for water, and now she's asking him for water. Give me this water that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw. Now she may still have been confused exactly what that water was. But she'd went to that well often enough, she was ready to stop coming to that well. He'd gotten her attention. How'd he get her attention? He found something in common they both needed. If you had to carry every drop of water that was used at your house, it wouldn't take you very long if somebody came and said, hey, I can offer you something that you won't have to carry water again. That's the way she heard it. I know that's not what he said, but that's the way she heard it. And her mind is, I'll never thirst again. I'll never have to come to this water, to this well to carry water again. Tell me about this. I want to know more about it. Isn't it interesting how powerful it is when in humility we begin with the common ground? Look back to Luke's writing, if you will, in Acts. You see there in Acts the 10th chapter, Peter's going to be sent to reach Cornelius. Again, we got oil and water in their mind because they saw that sharp boundary because of some teachings of the old law. And Peter is still kind of in shock, the idea that he's going to be sent to a Gentile's house. But when Luke records this, there's something almost magical about his humility. When he records this, instead of talking about, can you believe that Peter is going to be sent to this lowly Gentile? No, instead in verse 1, it talks about him being a centurion of the Italian regiment. Now notice this in verse 2, a devout man, and one who feared God with all of his household, who gave alms generously to the people and prayed to God always. Now, by the time we get to the end of this chapter, what are we going to learn? We're going to learn that this man needs to be baptized into Christ for the remission of sins. How does this chapter begin? This chapter does not begin with Luke saying, look at this horrible sinner. Instead, it begins with what many people devoted to God could say, hey, he's a lot like me. Why? In his understanding, he's devoted to God in the way he understands it. He fears God in the way he understands how to fear God. And with what God has given him, he is very generous in giving. And in his prayer life, he is devoted in his prayer life. Listen, I need to recognize that people who do not have a full understanding of what the truth of the gospel is, there are still things that we can find common ground. That's the place to start. You can't make it very far if your idea is, I want to start with all of the differences. Look over in Acts the 17th chapter. Paul goes into Athens, and you see there in verse 16, Acts 17 and verse 16. And now while Paul waited for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him when he saw that the city was given over to idols. Now, Athens was a beautiful town, but its beauty, if you were a Christian, wasn't really so beautiful. Because what made it beautiful to most people was the architecture and the kind of art of all of their gods and the temples they built for their gods. The old writings describe it more almost like a tourist attraction. People from around the world would come and they would walk into town, and there are books, thick books written just over what people saw when they came into Athens. And instead of Paul getting all excited saying, look at this architecture, look at these beautiful temples, look at these gods they've carved out, he looks at it and says, oh, look at these lost souls. This provokes my spirit. This is terrible. But when he stood before the people, he didn't start. He didn't start by saying, you horrible, pathetic people. No, instead, notice how he started here as we drop down to 22. He stood before them in 22. He said, men of Athens, I perceive that in all things you are very religious. So there's common ground. He's a very religious man. I perceive that you're a very religious man. For as I was passing through and considering the objects of your worship, isn't that a kind way to say it? I'm looking at the objects of your worship. I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. Therefore, the one whom you worship without knowing him, I proclaim to you. Brethren, that's a masterpiece, and that's a masterpiece we can do at the water cooler tomorrow. We can begin with the common ground tomorrow. Listen, we have religious neighbors all around us. that they do need to know to be baptized into Christ for remission of sin, and they need to know about the Lord's church. But already today, they are heavily devoted in benevolence works to help people around the world. There are individuals that they commit their life to spreading what they understand of the gospel, and some of them do it a lot more effectively than we do it. There are religious groups that are known for their high morals and their family values. I can appreciate someone that wants to hold together the plan of family the way God has taught it. There are so many things that if we would just kind of step off our high horse, we could begin on common ground. And we could do like Jesus. We could begin with some things that are the same. And what I need to see, and I know we'll run out of time, but I need to see that it's important to have dialogue. You see, when we go back to John, the 4th chapter, I'm just going to mention this quickly. Look in verse, by the way, you know, in a radio, a talk show, they'll have radio, what I'm trying to say, telephone call-ins. And we call that dialogue. But you know, oftentimes they'll start at the beginning of the hour, the top of the hour, and they'll have what? A monologue. What's the difference? A lot of times as Christians, all we believe in is a monologue. Oh, you want to know something about the Lord? Hush your mouth and I'm going to tell you everything you need to know. That doesn't work. Notice how Jesus did it. Jesus said, you can ask your questions. I'll ask my questions. We can answer each other back and forth. Let's have a dialogue about this. Let's have a conversation about this. And the conversation eventually led into a study right here on the spot. We may not do them all, but just notice this. In verse 7, what does it say there? It says, Jesus said to her. And in verse 9, what does it say? The woman of Samaria said to him. And in verse 10, what does it say? Jesus answered. And in verse 11, the woman said. And in verse 13, Jesus answered. And in 15, the woman said. And in 16, Jesus said. And in 17, the woman answered. In 19, the woman said. In 21, Jesus said. In 25, the woman said to him. In 26, Jesus said to her. What's happening here? They're going back and forth in open dialogue with each other. We're going to have to cross borders. And we're going to have to be willing to get into, please get this, honest, spiritual dialogue. Are you really honest? When somebody says, what'd you do this weekend? Do you tell them what you did Friday and Saturday and Sunday afternoon? But conveniently don't mention Sunday morning or night? Why not? I don't know if I want to have that dialogue. You need to ask yourself and you need to be praying about why you do not want to have a dialogue about the only thing on this earth that matters. You may be in talk with a coworker and something come up about money, and where does your money go? Would you tell where your money goes first? Well, the first thing we always do is we give to the Lord. Why? It's honest. Oh, I couldn't. Yeah. Do you realize the opportunities we would have to naturally talk about God if we were just honest? When people ask questions, if we were just honest. What means so much to you in your life? My family, making it to heaven, means everything. Am I honest enough to do that? David Shannon's got to work on this. And I tell you, I studied this lesson for me. And I want to share it with you. We could turn the world upside down if in our conversations we would be honest about what has turned our life right side up. But yet, we talk as if God doesn't exist. Isn't this time of year a beautiful time of year? Is that all it takes? Just ticking of a clock makes a beautiful time of year? No. Didn't God make a beautiful time of year? Tonight, I hope every one of us will leave here forgetting the borders, because then it's whoever God brings in front of us. And I hope we'll always look for the common ground. And I hope we'll be humble and kind and place ourselves beneath them to ask something of them. And then let's talk. Let's talk openly and honestly. And let God do what God does. God saves people. We just tell people about Him. Tonight, if you're not saved, there's nothing else that should matter to you. And really, there's nothing else that should matter to us. If we didn't passionately plead for you to be saved tonight, we'd be hypocrites. If we can help you in any way, we really mean that. We want to. We'd love to see you commit your life to Jesus Christ tonight, to be baptized for the remission of your sins, to be added to God's family, to be devoted to God, all out for God. Maybe you've begun that journey and you've lost sight of that journey. We would love to encourage you. We're not here to point fingers. We're not here to ask deep and personal questions about making you feel guilty. We want to encourage you. We want to help each other get to heaven. If we can pray with you, if we can encourage you, if you just want to have dialogue, we'd love to sit down and listen to you and talk with you. If we can help you in any way, come as we stand as we sing.